The other day, I did a part one on ergodicity, and basically the argument was ergodicity trumps expected value when it comes to choosing to bunt because expected value pulls into play those extremes, and coaches don't coach on attempting to score 10 runs. They don't really care about that. They care about scoring one run, at least one run to win the game. And this book by Keith Law, it's a really good book. And he has a much better chart in there to justify why you shouldn't bunt. And the chart that he uses is more binary. It says, hey, what's the probability of not scoring a run versus scoring at least one run? And that's really the chart that people should work off of. And in this book, he makes the argument that there's really only one time that even justifies choosing to bunt, and that's the first and second, nobody out, trying to create a second and third one out. All the other ones he dismisses out of hand, and he makes a really good argument for that, for why we shouldn't be bunting. But I'm a statistics teacher, but long before I learned stats, I was an athlete. And what I want to do is I want to just make an argument as to where the statisticians make this claim, and then how the coaches in uniform, how oftentimes those two things are in conflict. So what statistics folks do is they work off of this idea of a normal curve. And in a normal curve, basically what you're doing is you're trying to standardize behavior. You're trying to look at phenomenon, and then you place it into a curve, and then you can evaluate what's average and what's not average. Okay, and what is deemed as not average is what they call a standard deviation or variation off of the average. Okay, so in a normal curve, you've got this average behavior, and then you've got a standard deviation to the left and to the right. And statisticians that work off of this normal curve, they recognize that 68% of things should fall between one standard deviation. And whenever something doesn't fit this model, then that literally becomes off the charts. And many times you'll hear people say, well, that's an outlier. We don't want to consider that. It's an outlier. It's literally off the charts, maybe 3 standard deviations one way or another. Wilt Chamberlain, Joe DiMaggio, Secretariat, those would all be outliers, off the charts. We can't comprehend what it is we just saw. So scientists often dismiss those exceptions because they can't fit on a normal curve. And many times what statisticians will do is they'll talk about the gambling fallacy. And the gambling fallacy says we misinterpret randomness. Okay, so if I flipped a coin 5 times and I got these outcomes, these first 4 seem reasonable. I can tolerate that. A couple heads, a couple tails makes sense. But 5 heads in a row, like all of a sudden I think the coin is biased. And if I'm in Las Vegas, I want to jump in and I know things are going to turn the other way soon because the law of averages. And what scientists would say is, no, this is just as random as this. But you're just looking for patterns. And in this book, one of the quotes that really caused some great dialogue with me and some friends that teach with me is the idea of no such thing as a clutch hitter. There's no such thing as a clutch hitter. And the athlete in me knows that I definitely feel pressure in certain spots. And I've choked many times. If there's no such thing as a clutch hitter, would that also imply that there's no such thing as choking or pressure, right? It's just one extreme or the other. Either I ignore the pressure and I'm clutch, or I feel the pressure and I choke. So and all the athletes were like, of course there's those things. Like you can't even substantiate the idea that there's not. Of course we feel pressure. Anyone that ever watched Greg Norman collapse in the Masters know those things exist, right? So, but a scientist or a statistician will tell you what's happening is something called a regression to the mean. And what that means is the mean is just another way to say average. And what that means is all of us have this baseline ability. Okay. Some of us are endowed with more skill and ability than others, but we all have this baseline ability. And when you see someone get hot, it's not that they're hot. It's just that they're above the line, right? So don't try to assume that they're on this hot streak. They're just running a bunch of heads, right? And eventually the tails are going to pop up, or eventually they're going to fall and they're going to go below the baseline. So this idea of regression to the mean works off this idea of a normal curve, that all things fit somewhere on normal or standard. And that's how a lot of statisticians and scientists, they run their tests, and they always want to plot it to normal, and they've got this average behavior, and then they've got variation off of average. But I actually believe that sports are played not on a normal curve. I believe Nassim Taleb talks about fat tails, about how our behavior isn't normal. Our behavior represents more of this, and um, you'll see a lot of times the 80-20 rule, where you know a big chunk of our behavior is occupied here early, but then these things exist, these extremes, these fat tails, and these fat tails don't fit on a normal curve. Like, they're just outliers and way beyond three standard deviations. But down here is where I think we make sense of Secretariat and Wilt Chamberlain and Joe DiMaggio's streak, and pressure. And this is where things need to be evaluated in these fat tails, not on these standard curves. Because in a standard curve, a scientist and a statistician can actually make an argument that there is no such thing as clutch hitters and streaks. And I mean, I get it. Like, I know where it's coming from. It's a legitimate argument. But I've been on the foul line with 1 second left and choked. I've been behind the plate and looked at a runner at third base and questioned whether or not I should throw a curveball, because it puts a lot of pressure on me to block that pitch. I mean, that's what sports are. It's the wide right, for the field goal kicker. It's first tee on the Ryder Cup, where this golf shot isn't like every other golf shot I've attempted. I mean, I can't even comprehend a world where you would argue and that sports doesn't have this emotion to it. I mean, that's what sports are. I mean, that's why we rush the field after huge victories, is because we live in these fat tails, and that's where streaks lives, and pressure, and our change in our physiology. And I suppose a statistician or a scientist would in some way try to justify the yips, right? Like that's one of those things that sports people just cringe at, because they know it's real, and it's debilitating. And the regression to the mean can't explain the yips. Like, the regression to the mean, like, no, you might never come back to your base state. Like, it's real, and it sabotages our behavior. And there's no place for the yips on a normal curve. And so, uh, when people make arguments about not bunting, um, the first argument is mathematical, and ergodicity just kicks that to the curb. You can't look at expected run states. But then there's this other deeper layer that I think people miss. And sports aren't played on normal curves and charts, and sports isn't tossing coins and having one outcome be independent of another outcome. Right, that's the other thing that I didn't sort of speak to, is that this toss is independent of this toss, which is independent of this toss. But anyone that's been in a batter's box knows that if you strike out 4 times in a row, that fifth at bat takes on a different feel. My at bats aren't independent of each other. I definitely assume that that shame of sorts, and how that last at bat is approached. So this is part two of the idea of maybe why you should consider bunting.